In the golden kingdom of Valdoria, where ancient traditions clash with modern ambitions, a single cup of tea would shatter centuries of royal protocol and expose the darkest secrets lurking behind palace walls. What began as a peaceful morning in the royal chambers would soon spiral into a web of betrayal, forbidden love, and deadly schemes that would threaten not just the crown but the very foundation of the monarchy itself. When Queen Seraphina's trembling hands reached for her morning tea, she had no idea that her most trusted confidant had just signed her death warrant. The morning mist clung to the towering spires of Valdoria Castle like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their hold on the ancient stones that had witnessed 5 centuries of royal intrigue. Queen Seraphina Blackthorn stood at her chamber window, her emerald eyes reflecting the pale dawn light as she gazed across the sprawling kingdom that bore her family's name. At 42, she possessed the kind of regal beauty that commanded respect rather than mere admiration, sharp cheekbones that spoke of noble bloodlines, auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight, and a bearing that reminded everyone she encountered that she was born to rule. The queen's morning ritual never varied. At precisely 7 o'clock, she would rise from her canopied bed, don her silk robe embroidered with the Valdorian royal crest, a golden eagle clutching a crown, and move to her writing desk to review the day's correspondence.
This morning, however, something felt different. The air carried an unusual tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when even the birds fall silent.
Lady Isabella Ravencroft, the Queen's closest friend and personal secretary, entered the chambers with practiced quiet. Isabella had served in this capacity for nearly 15 years, ever since Queen Seraphina's coronation following her father's unexpected death. Where the Queen was fire and authority, Isabella was cool water and discretion, a woman of 38 with silvering blonde hair and intelligent gray eyes that missed nothing. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent her entire adult life navigating the treacherous currents of court politics.
"Your Majesty," Isabella murmured, setting down the ornate silver tea service on the mahogany table beside the Queen's desk. "Your morning tea, prepared exactly as you prefer." The Queen turned from the window, offering her friend a warm smile that transformed her austere features into something almost maternal.
"Thank you, Isabella. I don't know what I would do without you." She settled into her chair, a piece crafted from Valdorian oak that had been in the royal family for 3 generations.
"What does today's schedule hold?" Isabella consulted her leather-bound planner, though she could recite the day's events from memory. The morning cabinet meeting at 9, followed by the audience with the agricultural ministers at 11.
The ambassador from the neighboring kingdom of Astoria arrives at 2 for the trade negotiations, and this evening there's the state dinner for the visiting dignitaries. As Queen Seraphina reached for her teacup, Isabella's hand briefly trembled, a motion so slight that anyone else would have missed it entirely. But the Queen, trained from childhood to notice the smallest details that might indicate threat or opportunity, caught the gesture. She paused, her fingers hovering over the delicate porcelain handle.
"Isabella, are you feeling well? You seem unsettled this morning."
Isabella's composure recovered instantly, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I didn't sleep well last night. Perhaps too much excitement about today's important negotiations." The Queen nodded, accepting the explanation, and lifted the cup to her lips. The first sip of the perfectly brewed Earl Grey was exactly as she expected, fragrant, warm, with just the right amount of honey. The second sip, however, carried an undertone she couldn't quite identify, something slightly bitter beneath the familiar flavor. She set the cup down with a soft clink against the saucer. "This tea tastes different today." Did the kitchen change suppliers? Isabella's face remained perfectly neutral, but those who knew her well would have noticed the barely perceptible tightening around her eyes. "I believe they may have, Your Majesty. Shall I inquire?" Before the Queen could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the chamber. Prince Adrian, the Queen's younger brother and heir to the throne, entered without waiting for permission, a breach of protocol that would have earned anyone else a sharp rebuke. At 38, Adrian possessed the same striking features as his sister, though his dark hair and brooding expression gave him an altogether more dangerous air. He had always lived in Seraphina's shadow, and the resentment had grown more pronounced with each passing year. "Sister," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of urgency masked as casual conversation. "I trust you slept well?" "Well enough," Queen Seraphina replied, studying her brother's face. Adrian had never been particularly gifted at concealing his emotions, and this morning she detected something that made her pulse quicken. Anticipation, perhaps, or barely contained excitement. "You seem particularly energetic for such an early hour." Adrian's laugh sounded forced, like someone trying too hard to appear relaxed. "I've been looking forward to today's trade negotiations. The Astorian ambassador brings proposals that could change everything for Valdoria."
The queen reached for her tea again, then hesitated. Something in her brother's manner, combined with Isabella's earlier nervousness and the strange taste in her morning beverage, triggered an instinct honed by decades of navigating royal intrigue. She had learned from her father that paranoia, in measured doses, was simply another word for careful preparation. "Isabella," she said slowly, "please summon Dr. Montague. I'm feeling slightly unwell this morning." Isabella's composure cracked for just a moment. A flash of something that might have been panic crossing her features before she regained control. "Of course, Your Majesty. Shall I cancel your morning appointments? That won't be necessary. Just ask him to attend me here before the cabinet meeting." Adrian shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, his earlier confidence seeming to evaporate. "Perhaps it's simply pre-negotiation nerves, Serafina. These trade talks are crucial for the kingdom's future." The queen's eyes sharpened as she observed both her brother and her secretary. Years of ruling had taught her to read the currents of fear and ambition that flowed beneath the surface of every court interaction. What she saw now in these two people she trusted most sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Adrian," she said quietly, "when did you and Isabella last speak privately?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Prince Adrian's face flushed, and Isabella went very still. The kind of stillness that comes just before flight or violence. The queen felt her world shift, like standing on solid ground only to discover it was merely a thin crust over a vast chasm. We discussed the day's schedule yesterday evening," Adrian stammered, his natural arrogance deserting him entirely. "Nothing more than that." But Queen Serafina had already seen enough. The way Isabella's hand rested protectively near the tea service, the way her brother avoided direct eye contact, the synchronized rhythm of their breathing that spoke of shared secrets and careful planning. She had survived 15 years on the throne by trusting her instincts. And every instinct now screamed danger. "Leave the tea," she commanded, her voice taking on the steel that had cowed rebellious nobles and foreign diplomats alike. "Both of you, step away from it. Now." The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Through the tall windows, the sounds of the awakening castle filtered in, servants going about their duties, guards changing shifts, the normal rhythms of a kingdom beginning another day. But inside the royal chamber, three people faced each other across a gulf that yawned wider with each heartbeat. Isabella was the first to break. Her carefully maintained facade crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "Your Majesty, I can explain everything." "I'm certain you can," Queen Serafina replied. Though her voice remained steady, she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "The question is whether you'll choose to do so truthfully." Prince Adrian stepped forward, his face a mixture of desperation and defiance. "Serafina, you don't understand the pressures the kingdom faces. The people are growing restless, the treasury is strained, and your policies—" "My policies," the queen interrupted, rising from her chair with fluid grace despite the tremor in her hands, "have kept Valdoria prosperous and peaceful for 15 years. What I don't understand is how my own brother and my most trusted friend came to believe that poison was a suitable replacement for honest discourse." The word hung between them like a blade. Isabella collapsed into the nearest chair, her composure completely shattered, while Adrian's face went ashen. In that moment, Queen Serafina understood that her survival depended not just on her ability to rule, but on her willingness to treat those she loved as potential enemies. The morning sun climbed higher outside the windows, casting long shadows across the ornate chamber that had been the private sanctuary of Valdorian monarchs for generations. But sanctuary, the queen now realized, was an illusion that power could neither buy nor guarantee. As she faced the two people who had just tried to murder her, Queen Serafina Blackthorn began to understand that the greatest threats to any crown came not from external enemies but from the poisoned hearts of those closest to the throne. The royal guard arrived within minutes of Queen Serafina's summons, their polished boots echoing against the marble floors like thunderclaps in a cathedral. Captain Marcus Thornfield, a man whose loyalty had been tested in 3 minor wars and countless palace intrigues, entered the chamber with his characteristic blend of military precision and court diplomacy. His weathered face, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from the border conflicts of 8 years past, remained impassive as he surveyed the scene before him. Queen Serafina stood behind her desk like a general commanding a battlefield, her mourning robe replaced by a deep burgundy dress that seemed to emphasize her authority rather than diminish it. Prince Adrian had retreated to the far corner of the room, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, while Lady Isabella remained seated, her hands folded in her lap with the resigned dignity of someone who had already accepted her fate.
Captain Thornfield. The Queen's voice carried the crisp authority that had made her one of the most respected monarchs in the region's history. I need the tea service tested immediately for foreign substances. Use every resource available. Have the royal chemist examine it. Consult with Dr. Phyllisera. Montague, bring in experts from the university if necessary. Thornfield's eyes flicked briefly to the ornate tea set, then to the two suspects, before returning to his sovereign. His expression revealed nothing, but the slight tightening around his eyes betrayed his understanding of the gravity of the situation. Immediately, Your Majesty. Should I confine the Prince and Lady Ravencroft pending the results? The question struck the chamber like lightning. Prince Adrian's head snapped up, his face contorting with indignation and fear in equal measure. Confine me? I am heir to the throne of Valdoria. This is preposterous. Queen Seraphina studied her brother with the cold calculation that had served her well in diplomatic negotiations with hostile foreign powers. You are also potentially a would-be regicide. Your royal blood grants you many privileges, Adrian, but immunity from treason is not among them. Isabella finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the tense atmosphere. Your Majesty, if I may. Prince Adrian knew nothing of my actions. This conspiracy, if we can call it that, was mine alone. The Queen's eyebrows rose slightly, a gesture that those familiar with her moods recognized as extremely dangerous. How noble of you, Isabella, but I'm afraid your attempt at chivalry doesn't align with the evidence. My brother's behavior this morning suggested foreknowledge, not surprise. Adrian stepped forward, his hands spread in a gesture of supplication that looked foreign on someone accustomed to demanding rather than requesting. Seraphina, I admit I was aware that Isabella harbored concerns about your leadership, but I never imagined she would resort to such extreme measures. Concerns about my leadership, the Queen repeated, her tone suggesting she was tasting each word for its particular flavor of betrayal. How thoughtful of you both to keep these concerns from reaching my ears through normal channels. Captain, proceed with the arrangements I requested. As Thornfield moved toward the tea service, Isabella suddenly stood, her movement sharp enough to cause the guards flanking the door to step forward. Wait, please. Her voice carried a note of desperate dignity that commanded attention. Before you proceed with your tests, I believe explanations are owed. Not excuses, Your Majesty. I offer none. But perhaps some context that might help you understand how we arrived at this terrible morning. Queen Seraphina settled into her chair, every inch of her bearing conveying that she was prepared to listen, but not to forgive. Speak. Isabella clasped her hands before her, and for a moment she looked every one of her 38 years, and several more besides. The kingdom faces challenges that have been edited in the reports you receive. The northern provinces are experiencing unrest that goes beyond simple taxation disputes. The Merchants Guild has been privately questioning the wisdom of your trade policies. There have been whispered conversations in the noble houses about the need for a more flexible approach to governance. The Queen's expression didn't change, but Captain Thornfield noticed the slight tightening of her grip on the arms of her chair. Continue. I believed, Isabella's voice grew stronger, as if confession was restoring some of her natural confidence, that the kingdom needed leadership that could adapt more quickly to changing circumstances. Prince Adrian has always shown greater willingness to consider alternative perspectives, to work more closely with the noble houses and the merchant interests. Adrian's face flushed, though whether from shame or suppressed anger was difficult to determine. Isabella, please. No, Adrian. Isabella turned to face the prince directly. For to be honest now, we must be completely honest. You agreed that the Queen's rigid adherence to tradition was hampering the kingdom's progress. You agreed that change was necessary. Queen Seraphina's laugh was like ice cracking on a winter pond. So you decided that rather than present your concerns through the established channels, the council, the Parliament of Nobles, or even a private conversation with me, poison was the more diplomatic solution. The weight of her words seemed to crush whatever defiance remained in the two conspirators. Adrian slumped against the wall, his face buried in his hands, while Isabella's shoulders sagged as if she were physically carrying the enormity of her actions. The substance, Isabella whispered, was not meant to kill immediately. Dr. Harrington from the University of Astoria provided it. He assured me it would create a gradual decline that would appear to be natural illness. The transition of power would be peaceful, constitutional. No one would ever suspect Dr. Harrington, Captain Thornfield interrupted, his voice sharp with professional interest. The same Dr. Harrington who was expelled from the Royal Academy 5 years ago for unethical experimentation? Isabella nodded miserably. He approached me 3 months ago with reports about the kingdom's instability that didn't match the official summaries reaching the Queen. He suggested that sometimes, for the greater good, difficult decisions must be made by those with the vision to see beyond immediate consequences. Queen Seraphina rose slowly from her chair, her movement deliberate and predatory. And you, my dear friend of 15 years, decided that you possessed such vision. The sarcasm in her voice was sharper than any blade. Isabella flinched as if she had been physically struck. Your Majesty, I have watched you struggle with the impossible demands of modern monarchy while clinging to traditions that no longer serve the people's needs. I believed that I was helping you, relieving you of burdens you shouldn't have to bear. How thoughtful, the Queen's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more terrifying than any shout. And Adrian, what was your vision for this new, more flexible approach to governance? Prince Adrian raised his head, his eyes red but his voice steadier than it had been since the confrontation began. I wanted to modernize the monarchy, Seraphina. Work more closely with Parliament, give the noble houses greater say in policy decisions, open trade negotiations that you've been blocking for years. I thought if you were too ill to rule effectively, you might abdicate in favor of a regency that could implement necessary changes. Without once considering that these policies you find so necessary might be exactly what I've been working to prevent, the Queen replied. Did it occur to either of you that my rigid adherence to tradition might be the only thing standing between Valdoria and the kind of political chaos that has consumed our neighboring kingdoms? The silence that followed was profound. Through the windows, the normal sounds of castle life continued. Servants calling to each other across courtyards, horses clattering over cobblestones, the distant sound of children playing in the village beyond the walls. But inside the chamber, 3 people grappled with the realization that their mourning had irrevocably shattered relationships and trust that had taken decades to build. Captain Thornfield cleared his throat gently. Your Majesty, the chemist awaits your pleasure. Queen Seraphina nodded, then turned once more to face her brother and her former friend. You will both be confined to separate quarters pending the results of the examination. Captain Thornfield will ensure you're treated with the dignity your positions deserve, but you will not be permitted to communicate with each other, or with anyone outside the castle until this matter is resolved. Adrian straightened, some of his royal bearing returning despite the circumstances. And if the tea proves to be poisoned? The Queen's smile was as cold as winter moonlight. Then we will have a very different conversation about justice, mercy, and the price of treason. As the guards escorted Prince Adrian and Lady Isabella from the chamber, Queen Seraphina remained standing behind her desk, her hands resting flat on its surface as if drawing strength from the solid wood. Captain Thornfield paused at the door, studying his sovereign with the careful attention of someone who had served the crown long enough to recognize when its bearer was truly shaken. Your Majesty, if I may, you handled that with remarkable composure. The Queen's laugh held no humor. Composure, Captain, is simply another word for the luxury of falling apart in private. Close the door behind you, please. And Captain?
Yes, Your Majesty.
Double the guard rotations. If my own brother and closest friend could contemplate regicide, I suspect this morning's revelations are only the beginning of our troubles. As the door closed, leaving her alone in the chamber where she had nearly died, Queen Seraphina Blackthorn finally allowed her composure to crack. Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of her desk, and for the first time in 15 years of rule, she wondered if the crown was worth the weight of its betrayals. The royal laboratory occupied the entire eastern wing of the castle's basement level, its stone walls lined with shelves containing instruments that seemed to bridge the gap between medieval alchemy and modern science. Dr. Elias Montague, the kingdom's chief physician and royal chemist, had served 3 monarchs over his 40-year career, but he had never before been asked to test the sovereign's morning tea for poison. His weathered hands, still steady despite his 72 years, worked with methodical precision as he prepared the various tests that would either condemn 2 of the kingdom's most prominent figures or exonerate them entirely. Queen Seraphina descended the narrow stone steps accompanied by Captain Thornfield, her footsteps echoing in the confined space. She had changed into a practical dark blue dress that allowed for easier movement. Though she retained the Valdorian crown, a circlet of white gold set with emeralds that had belonged to her great-grandmother. The crown served as both a symbol of her authority and a reminder to everyone present that despite the morning's events, she remained the undisputed ruler of Valdoria. Dr. Montague. She greeted the elderly physician with genuine warmth. Despite the circumstances,
She had always maintained cordial relationships with the castle's staff, believing that loyalty was earned through respect rather than fear.
The doctor turned from his workstation, his pale blue eyes reflecting both professional curiosity and personal concern.
Your Majesty, I must say that in all my years of service, this is the most distressing examination I've ever been asked to perform.
What have you discovered? Dr. Montague gestured toward a collection of glass vials and instruments arrayed across his workbench. I have completed 3 different analyses of the tea sample. The results are conclusive and deeply troubling. He lifted a small glass slide and held it toward the light filtering through the laboratory's high windows. The tea contained a substance called vesperine, a plant extract derived from the whispering willow trees that grow wild in the Astoria borderlands. In small doses, it would cause gradual weakness, confusion, and eventually complete incapacitation that would mimic a wasting illness. The Queen felt her knees weaken slightly, and Captain Thornfield moved closer, ready to offer support if needed. How long would such a process take? Given the concentration I detected, Your Majesty, you would have begun feeling mild symptoms within hours: slight dizziness, difficulty concentrating. Over the course of 3 to 4 weeks, the symptoms would have progressed to severe weakness, memory loss, and eventual catatonia. To anyone observing, it would appear to be a mysterious illness that gradually rendered you unfit to rule. The clinical precision of his description made the conspiracy feel more real and more horrifying. Queen Seraphina had escaped death not through any dramatic last-moment rescue, but through the simple instinct to trust her suspicions about an altered taste in her morning beverage. "Doctor," Captain Thornfield interjected, "is this substance known to be used as a poison?" Dr. Montague nodded grimly. "Vesperine has been employed for political assassinations in several neighboring kingdoms over the past decade. Its advantage, from a conspirator's perspective, is that it leaves no obvious traces and creates symptoms that appear entirely natural. Detection requires specific testing that would rarely be performed unless poison was already suspected. The implications hung heavy in the laboratory air." Queen Seraphina moved to one of the windows, gazing out at the castle grounds where her subjects went about their daily lives, unaware that their monarchy had nearly collapsed before breakfast. "Is there an antidote?" "Fortunately, yes. Vesperine's effects can be completely reversed with proper treatment, provided it's administered before the final stages of poisoning. However, Your Majesty—" "Doctor," Montague hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he needed to say next. "Speak freely, Doctor. The sophistication of this attempt suggests extensive planning and considerable knowledge of both chemistry and royal protocols." Lady Ravencroft may have administered the poison, but she almost certainly had expert guidance. The individual who provided the vesperine would need advanced training in botanical chemistry. Captain Thornfield's expression darkened. "Dr. Harrington of Astoria University." Lady Ravencroft mentioned his name during questioning. Queen Seraphina turned from the window, her face set with determination. "Send word to our intelligence contacts in Astoria immediately. I want to know everything about Dr. Oskell. Harrington's activities over the past 6 months, who he's met with, what he's been researching, and most importantly, who might be funding his work." "Your Majesty," Dr. Montague ventured carefully, "there's another matter we should discuss. If Dr. Harrington approached Lady Ravencroft with this scheme, it's possible that similar approaches have been made to other members of the court." The thought sent a chill through the Queen that had nothing to do with the cool air of the underground laboratory. "You're suggesting this conspiracy might extend beyond Isabella and Adrian?" "I'm suggesting that a foreign agent capable of producing vesperine and gaining the trust of your personal secretary might not limit himself to a single recruitment attempt. Your Majesty should consider the possibility that other members of the court have been approached with similar propositions." Captain Thornfield stepped forward. "I recommend an immediate security review of all personnel with access to Your Majesty's personal quarters, meals, and daily routine. If this conspiracy is broader than we initially suspected, we need to identify all potential threats immediately." Queen Seraphina nodded, though the prospect of treating her entire household staff as potential assassins filled her with a weariness that seemed to settle into her bones. "Make it so, Captain. But conduct the review discreetly. I don't want panic spreading through the castle or rumors reaching the noble houses until we have a clearer picture of what we're facing." "Doctor," Montague cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, there's one more thing. The concentration of vesperine in your tea was precisely calibrated, not too much, which would have caused immediate obvious symptoms, but exactly enough to begin the gradual decline. This level of precision suggests whoever prepared the dose has significant experience with the substance." The implication was clear. This wasn't Dr. Harrington's first foray into political poisoning. Queen Seraphina found herself wondering how many other monarchs or government officials in neighboring kingdoms might have succumbed to mysterious wasting illnesses over the past few years. Doctor, I want you to prepare a complete report on Vesperin, its effects, detection methods, antidotes, and any known historical uses. If we're dealing with a professional poisoner, I want to understand his methods completely. Of course, Your Majesty. I should have the report completed by this evening. As they prepared to leave the laboratory, Captain Thornfield voiced the question that all three were thinking. Your Majesty, what are your intentions regarding Prince Adrian and Lady Ravencroft? Queen Seraphina paused at the foot of the stone staircase, her hand resting on the rough wall that had stood for centuries, supporting generation after generation of Valdorian rulers. That depends on what we discover about the scope of this conspiracy, Captain. If Isabella and Adrian were merely manipulated by a foreign agent, justice will be tempered with mercy. But if they were willing participants in a broader plot against the crown, she let the sentence hang unfinished. The three climbed the stairs in silence, each lost in contemplation of how quickly the foundations of trust and loyalty could be undermined by ambition and outside influence. As they reached the main level of the castle, Queen Seraphina paused again, struck by how normal everything appeared. Servants hurried past with linens and meal trays, guards stood at their posts with practiced vigilance, and through the tall windows she could see courtiers strolling in the gardens, discussing whatever issues occupied their attention that morning. None of them knew how close they had come to witnessing the beginning of a succession crisis that could have plunged Valdoria into chaos. The Queen realized that her survival was only the first step in what might prove to be a much larger battle for the stability of her kingdom. Captain, she said as they parted ways in the main corridor, increase security around the castle's communication systems as well. If Dr. Harrington has agents within our borders, we need to prevent them from reporting back to their employers until we've identified the full extent of the threat. Immediately, Your Majesty. As Queen Seraphina made her way back to her chambers to prepare for the day's official duties that had suddenly become far more complicated, she reflected on the bitter irony of her situation. She had survived an assassination attempt only to discover that her greatest challenge might not be identifying her enemies but determining which of her friends could still be trusted. The crown felt heavier on her head than it had in years, weighted not just with its traditional burden of responsibility, but with the new understanding that even in her own castle, surrounded by people who had sworn loyalty to her crown, she might be walking among those who wished her dead. The emergency session of the Valdorian Royal Council convened in the Chamber of Swords, a circular room whose walls displayed weapons from 5 centuries of the kingdom's military history. Queen Seraphina had chosen this venue deliberately. Surrounded by the steel that had defended her realm for generations, she felt better equipped to face whatever new revelations the investigation might bring. The afternoon light streamed through stained glass windows depicting great victories of Valdorian history, casting colored shadows across the polished oak table where 12 of the kingdom's most powerful figures sat in tense silence. Lord Chancellor Edmund Blackwood, a man whose family had served the crown for 4 generations, cleared his throat nervously. At 65, he had weathered numerous political storms, but treason within the royal family was uncharted territory even for his extensive experience. Your Majesty, the Council has reviewed Captain Thornfield's preliminary security assessment. The findings are disturbing. Queen Seraphina sat at the head of the table, her posture perfect despite the weight of exhaustion that had been building since the morning's revelations. She had managed to conduct her scheduled meetings with agricultural ministers and foreign ambassadors without revealing any sign of the crisis brewing within the castle walls, but the effort had drained her considerably. Present your findings, Lord Chancellor. Blackwood consulted the documents before him, his weathered hands steady despite the gravity of what he was about to reveal. Captain Thornfield's investigation has uncovered evidence that Dr. Harrington made contact with at least 3 other members of the court staff over the past 4 months. A kitchen servant named Thomas Hartwell received payment for providing detailed information about Your Majesty's dietary preferences and daily routines. Margaret Sinclair, one of the head housekeepers, was approached with offers of money for her cooperation in some unspecified future endeavor. The Queen felt her stomach tighten. And the third? Master of Arms Geoffrey Northampton was contacted about potential changes in palace security procedures that might be implemented under new leadership. The implications struck the council like thunder. Geoffrey Northampton controlled access to the castle's weapons and supervised the training of the royal guards. If he had been compromised, the conspiracy reached far deeper than anyone had initially suspected. Defense Minister Victoria Harrington, no relation to the Astorian doctor, despite the shared surname. Has Master Northampton been questioned? Captain Thornfield, who had been standing at attention near the chamber doors, stepped forward. Master Northampton is currently secured in the tower quarters.
He claims he rejected Dr. Harrington's overtures and reported them to no one because he wasn't certain they represented a genuine threat. He insists he never provided any information or assistance. "And do you believe him?" the Queen asked.
Thornfield's expression remained professionally neutral. His story is consistent under questioning, and we found no evidence of payment or suspicious activity. However, his failure to report the contact represents a serious breach of security protocol. Finance Minister Robert Ashford, whose ledgers tracked every coin flowing through the kingdom's treasury, raised his hand for recognition. "Your Majesty, I've reviewed the financial records for all court personnel over the past 6 months. Thomas Hartwell received payments totaling 50 gold sovereigns, far more than his annual salary, from sources he claimed were family inheritance. The payments came through Astorian banks. The pieces of the conspiracy were forming a clearer picture, and Queen Seraphina didn't like what she saw. So we have confirmation that at least one staff member was definitely compromised. The second was approached but may have refused, and a third failed to report suspicious contact." "What about Lady Isabella and Prince Adrian? Have they provided any additional information?" Lord Chancellor Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. "Lady Ravencroft has been cooperating fully with the investigation. She's provided detailed accounts of her meetings with Dr. Beckett. Harrington, including the political arguments he used to convince her that Your Majesty's policies were damaging the kingdom. She maintains that Prince Adrian knew only that she had concerns about the realm's direction, not that she intended to take direct action." "Doctor, never..." "And my brother's version of events? Prince Adrian admits to discussing his frustrations with the current administration with Lady Ravencroft but denies any knowledge of the poisoning plot. He claims he believed Lady Ravencroft was simply gathering information to present a formal proposal for policy changes to Your Majesty." Queen Seraphina's laugh held no humor. How remarkably convenient for both of them that neither knew the full extent of what the other was planning. Foreign Minister Catherine Voss, a woman whose diplomatic career had taught her to recognize deception in all its forms, spoke carefully. "Your Majesty, while we're focusing on the internal conspiracy, we should also consider the broader implications. Harrington's operation appears sophisticated and well-funded. This suggests backing from a foreign power rather than simply an individual acting alone." "Elaborate." "Establishing contact with multiple court personnel, providing substantial payments, procuring rare poisons, and developing detailed intelligence about royal routines. These activities require resources and expertise that exceed what a single academic could manage independently. Someone wanted you removed from power badly enough to invest considerable money and effort in making it happen." The observation sent a chill through the council chamber. Queen Seraphina had always been aware that foreign powers monitored Valdoria's affairs, but the idea that one of them had actively attempted to overthrow her government was sobering. Trade Minister William Fairfax leaned back in his chair, his merchant's mind working through possibilities. "Your Majesty, it might be relevant that the Astorian trade delegation was scheduled to arrive today for negotiations. If you had fallen ill this morning and been unable to participate, Prince Adrian would have conducted those talks as regent. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental." Queen Seraphina found herself wondering what concessions her brother might have been prepared to offer to Valdoria's neighbors, and whether those concessions had been part of the conspiracy from the beginning. "Captain Thornfield," she said, "I want the Astorian delegation confined to their quarters pending further investigation. Diplomatically, of course. Extend apologies for the delay and cite urgent domestic matters requiring my attention." "Already done, Your Majesty." The delegation arrived 2 hours ago and was informed that the negotiations would be postponed. Justice Minister Harold Pemberton, whose responsibility for the kingdom's legal system had given him extensive experience with treason cases, cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, we must also discuss the question of formal charges and trials. If we proceed with treason accusations against Prince Adrian and Lady Ravencroft, the proceedings will be public and could destabilize confidence in the monarchy."
The political calculations were as complex as they were distasteful.
Queen Seraphina had to balance the demands of justice against the need to maintain the appearance of stability that kept ambitious nobles and foreign powers from sensing weakness. What alternatives exist? For Lady Ravencroft, if she continues to cooperate fully and if evidence confirms she was manipulated by foreign agents, charges might be reduced to conspiracy and sedition rather than full treason. For Prince Adrian, Pemberton hesitated. "Speak plainly, Minister. For Prince Adrian, the situation is more complex because of his position as heir. If he was genuinely unaware of the poisoning plot, he might face charges related to failure to report seditious conversations. If he was a willing participant, even without full knowledge of the details, the charges could be much more serious." Queen Seraphina stood and moved to one of the windows, gazing out at the kingdom she had spent 15 years protecting and improving. The weight of the crown felt crushing, not because of its physical presence, but because of the impossible choices it represented. "There's another consideration," she said without turning from the window. "If foreign powers are actively working to destabilize our government, they won't stop with one failed attempt. We may have prevented this particular plot, but we haven't eliminated the underlying threat." Defense Minister Harrington nodded grimly. "Your Majesty is correct. Our intelligence suggests that similar operations may have been attempted in other kingdoms over the past 2 years. Several rulers have died or abdicated due to mysterious illnesses or unexpected political crises." The scope of the threat was becoming clearer, and it was larger than anyone had initially imagined. Queen Serafina turned back to face the council, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. "We're not just dealing with a domestic conspiracy. We're facing a coordinated campaign by foreign powers to reshape the political landscape of our region. Our response must address both the immediate crisis and the larger threat." She resumed her seat at the head of the table, every inch of her bearing conveying the authority that had made her one of the most respected monarchs in recent memory. "Lord Chancellor, prepare formal charges against Thomas Hartwell for treason and accepting bribes from foreign agents. His cooperation with the investigation will be considered during sentencing, but his betrayal cannot go unpunished." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Lady Ravenscroft will face charges of conspiracy and sedition. If she continues to cooperate fully and helps us understand the full scope of Dr. Harrington's operation, I'm prepared to consider clemency." "And Prince Adrian?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Queen Serafina looked around the table at faces that reflected her own understanding of how much hung in the balance. "Prince Adrian will face house arrest pending completion of the investigation. If evidence confirms he was an unwitting participant, he'll be stripped of his position as heir and exiled from the kingdom." If evidence suggests willing participation in treason, she let the sentence trail off, but every person in the chamber understood the implications. The remainder of the council session focused on security measures, intelligence gathering, and preparations for what might prove to be a protracted struggle against foreign interference in Valdoria's affairs. As the ministers filed out to begin implementing the Queen's decisions, Captain Thornfield remained behind. "Your Majesty, if I may, you're handling an impossible situation with remarkable wisdom." Queen Serafina's smile was tired, but genuine. "Wisdom, Captain, is simply another word for learning from other people's disasters before they become your own. Make sure the castle remains secure tonight. I suspect tomorrow will bring new challenges that we haven't yet imagined." As evening fell over Valdoria Castle, Queen Serafina sat alone in her chambers, reviewing intelligence reports and wondering how many other threats might be lurking in the shadows beyond her awareness. The crown that had been passed down through 5 centuries of her family's rule had never felt heavier, but she had never been more determined to prove worthy of its weight. Dawn broke gray and cold over Valdoria Castle 3 days after the attempted assassination, casting the ancient stones in shades of silver that matched Queen Serafina's somber mood. She stood in the throne room, resplendent in ceremonial robes of deep purple trimmed with gold, the traditional garb for pronouncing royal justice. The great hall had been prepared for what would become known in Valdorian history as the trial of whispered treason, though the proceedings would be anything but public. Captain Thornfield's investigation had uncovered the full scope of Dr. Harrington's network, revealing a conspiracy that stretched across 3 kingdoms and implicated at least a dozen individuals in various roles. The Astorian academic had been operating with funding and direction from a coalition of noble houses and merchant guilds who believed that the region's traditional monarchies were obstacles to profitable political change. The trial began at precisely 9 o'clock. Queen Serafina took her place on the throne of Valdoria. A massive chair carved from a single piece of black oak and adorned with emeralds and silver that had been the seat of royal justice for 400 years. The throne room's walls, lined with portraits of previous monarchs, seemed to watch as the current queen prepared to render judgment on those who had betrayed her trust. Lady Isabella Ravenscroft entered first, flanked by guards but unshackled, her dignity intact despite the gravity of her situation. She had spent the past 3 days in comfortable quarters cooperating fully with investigators and providing detailed accounts of her recruitment by Dr. Harrington. Her confession had revealed not just the mechanics of the poisoning plot, but the sophisticated psychological manipulation used to convince her that betraying her queen was actually an act of patriotic service to the realm. Lady Isabella Ravenscroft, Queen Serafina's voice carried the formal cadence required by law and tradition. You stand accused of conspiracy to commit treason, sedition against the crown, and accepting direction from foreign agents in a plot against the sovereign authority of Valdoria. How do you answer these charges? Isabella raised her head, meeting her former friend's eyes directly. I am guilty of all charges, Your Majesty.
I offer no excuse for my actions, though I humbly request that the court consider the evidence of my manipulation by foreign agents as a mitigating factor, not an absolution. The honesty of her response earned murmurs of approval from the small assembly of nobles and court officials who had been permitted to witness the proceedings. Justice Minister Pemberton stepped forward to present the evidence. Detailed records of Isabella's meetings with Dr. Harrington, financial transfers through Astorian banks, and correspondence that revealed the systematic way she had been recruited and directed. Your Majesty, Pemberton concluded, while Lady Ravencroft's cooperation has been invaluable in exposing the broader conspiracy, the law is clear regarding treason against the crown. However, the evidence strongly supports her claim that she was deliberately manipulated by professional agents, trained in psychological influence. Queen Seraphina studied the woman who had been her closest friend and confidant for 15 years. The betrayal still stung, but her anger had been tempered by understanding the sophisticated methods used to turn Isabella against her. Lady Ravencroft, you have served this court with distinction for many years. Your betrayal cuts deeper because of the trust and affection I held for you, but your cooperation in exposing this conspiracy has undoubtedly saved Valdorian lives and prevented further attempts against the crown. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, though she maintained her composure. Therefore, the Queen continued, I sentence you to exile from the Kingdom of Valdoria for a period of 10 years, with the possibility of return contingent upon your continued assistance in identifying and disrupting similar conspiracies in neighboring realms. Your titles and properties will be held in trust to be returned upon successful completion of your exile. The sentence was severe but merciful, exile rather than execution, with the possibility of eventual redemption. Isabella bowed deeply before being escorted from the throne room, her dignity intact despite the weight of her punishment. Prince Adrian entered next, and the change in the chamber's atmosphere was immediately noticeable. Where Isabella had shown remorse and acceptance, Adrian radiated defiance mixed with barely controlled fear. His 3 days of interrogation had revealed a man whose ambition had made him vulnerable to manipulation, but whose actual knowledge of the poisoning plot remained questionable. Prince Adrian Blackthorne, Queen Seraphina's voice took on a different quality when addressing her brother. You stand accused of sedition, conspiracy against the crown, and failure to report treasonous activities. Additionally, evidence suggests possible knowing participation in a foreign conspiracy to destabilize the Valdorian monarchy. Adrian straightened, his royal bearing asserting itself despite his circumstances. Sister, Your Majesty, I am guilty of harboring doubts about certain policies, and of failing to report Lady Ravencroft's concerning statements. But I swear by our father's memory and our family's honor that I had no knowledge of any plot to harm you. The trial proceeded with meticulous attention to evidence and testimony. Captain Thornfield presented intelligence gathered from interrogating the captured conspirators and analyzing correspondence found in Isabella's quarters. The picture that emerged was complex. Adrian had indeed been recruited by Dr. Harrington's network, but his role had been limited to providing legitimacy to what he believed were efforts to influence policy through traditional political channels. The evidence suggests, Justice Minister Pemberton reported, that Prince Adrian was intended to be an unwitting figurehead for the conspiracy. His ambitions were cultivated and his legitimate concerns about governance were amplified, but he was kept ignorant of the most serious aspects of the plot. Foreign Minister Voss added her analysis. Your Majesty, intelligence from our allies confirms that this pattern recruiting ambitious but naive royal family members as unknowing assets has been employed in at least 3 other kingdoms over the past 18 months. Queen Seraphina faced the most difficult decision of her reign. Her brother had betrayed her trust and endangered the kingdom, but the evidence suggested he had been manipulated rather than willingly treacherous. The law demanded punishment, but justice required consideration of intent and circumstances. Prince Adrian, she said finally, your actions, whether born of ambition or naivety, have endangered our realm and our people. You allowed yourself to be recruited by foreign agents and failed to report treasonous conversations. While I accept that you may not have known the full extent of the conspiracy, your participation provided legitimacy to those who sought to destroy our monarchy. Adrian's face went pale, but he maintained his dignity as she continued. Therefore, you are hereby stripped of your position as heir to the throne of Valdoria and banished from the kingdom for life. Your titles and properties are forfeit to the crown. You will be permitted to depart with sufficient funds to establish yourself elsewhere, but you may never return to Valdorian soil. The sentence hit Adrian like a physical blow. He had expected punishment, but permanent exile and the loss of his inheritance represented the complete destruction of his identity and future. For a moment his composure cracked completely. Seraphina, please, I never meant for any of this to happen. I was trying to help the kingdom. I believe you were, the Queen replied, her voice gentler but still implacable. But intentions don't erase consequences, and the throne demands better judgment than you have shown. The remainder of the day was spent addressing the other conspirators. Thomas Hartwell, the kitchen servant who had provided information about the Queen's routines, was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment with hard labor. Master of Arms Geoffrey Northampton, whose failure to report suspicious contact had been deemed negligent rather than treacherous, was stripped of his position but allowed to remain in the kingdom as a common citizen. As evening fell and the formal proceedings concluded, Queen Seraphina found herself alone in the throne room for the first time since the crisis began. The weight of the day's decisions pressed down on her like a physical burden, and for the first time in her reign she wondered whether she possessed the strength to continue bearing the crown's responsibilities. Captain Thornfield appeared in the doorway, his weathered face showing concern for his sovereign's well-being. Your Majesty, the castle is secure, the conspirators have been dealt with according to your wishes, and our intelligence networks are working to identify and neutralize similar threats throughout the region. Queen Seraphina nodded, though she remained seated on the throne that had witnessed centuries of royal decisions. Tell me, Captain, in your professional opinion, have we seen the end of this particular threat? Thornfield considered the question carefully. The immediate conspiracy has been neutralized, Your Majesty. Doctor, Harrington is in custody, his network has been exposed, and the foreign powers backing him know that their operation has failed. However, the underlying motivations that made this conspiracy possible haven't disappeared. There are still those who believe traditional monarchies are obstacles to their ambitions, and they will likely try different approaches in the future. The Queen's laugh held exhaustion rather than humor. So this was not a crisis resolved, but rather the first battle in a longer war. I believe so, Your Majesty, but today's events have also demonstrated something important. When the crown stands firm and justice is fairly applied, conspiracy crumbles and loyalty is strengthened. As Queen Seraphina finally rose from the throne and made her way back to her chambers, she reflected on how profoundly the events of the past few days had changed her understanding of power and responsibility. She had survived an assassination attempt, exposed a foreign conspiracy, and been forced to exile her own brother and closest friend. The crown felt heavier on her head than ever before, but she had also never been more certain of her right to wear it. The kingdom of Aldoria would face new challenges and new threats, but Queen Seraphina Blackthorn had proven to herself and to her subjects that she possessed both the wisdom to recognize danger and the courage to meet it with decisive action. As she settled into her chambers for her first truly peaceful night's sleep since the crisis began, she knew that tomorrow would bring new responsibilities and new tests of her leadership. But tonight, the crown was secure, the kingdom was safe, and justice had been served. For a monarch who had learned that power's greatest enemy was often found among those trusted most, it was enough. Royal scandal. Camilla caught attempting to poison King Charles.